As with all stiffening, it's good to have a good quality brush. This is a bristle brush, and they are, in my opinion, the best brushes you can use for stiffening. So I'm going to show you how this works on some different fabrics. As you can see, the stiffener in here, it's quite an amber colour. And what I'm going to do is, with most things, I'm going to dip just the tip of my brush in and wipe most of it off before you go onto your fabric. Especially with things like felt, this is important, so you don't leave a residue on the top of the felt, or so you don't get a big blob of stiffener in one spot and not much in another. So again, technique is to dip the tip of my brush in, wipe the excess off on my jar, and what I'm going to do with felt is I'm going to start moving my brush in this way that I'm going to stiffen my felt. And when I brush my stiffener on, I'm right at the start using light strokes just so I don't get too much stiffener in one spot. And then once I start to go, I can get a bit heavier with the brush, and I'm really working that stiffener into the fabric. If you need a little bit more stiffener, just dip it in again, and away I go back onto this felt, working the stiffener in. So you can see the stiffener there on the top for a second when I brush it, but then after a few seconds it soaks into the felt and you don't have a surface film. Okay, so that's my felt. I've also got a different lighter piece of felt here to show you what happens. So as you can see here, as soon as the stiffener is touching the felt, you can see that going quite dark there. This is only because the felt's wet though, and when that dries it'll be nice and, well, just the colour you want it, just the same as it started. If we turn over onto the back, you can see that the stiffener hasn't come all the way through, except for just here, which is good. So normally stiffening on the back or the underneath of our hat anyway, but there's no residue there, and so I'm just going to let that dry. Now onto the parasol. I tend to be a little more heavy-handed with parasol. You don't have to be as careful. It can take a lot more stiffener, and when you get the stiffener on it, it actually looks a lot nicer and shinier. So yeah, you don't have to be anywhere near as careful with the parasol, but as you can see, it goes on quite easily, and because it's quite thin, it'll go straight through to the other side. That's probably very heavy-handed on that piece, but that's going to be fine. I'll just pop that there to dry. Next I've got a piece of cotton. As you can see, it soaks up the stiffener really well. So now why would I be stiffening this? Well, I could make French flowers out of this. And so if you are doing something like that, you probably want to keep the stiffener as even as you can. That is, make sure you wet the entire piece of fabric. Otherwise it'll turn out a little bit blotchy, because it does change the colour, not just because the stiffener's coloured. If I was using our resin stiffener, which is totally clear, it'd still change the colour of the fabric to an extent. This is a piece of organza, silk organza, that I'm going to try. And again, this is a really thin fabric, so it doesn't take much stiffener to get that done. I've used this stiffener with the French flower making tools and it goes really well, so you don't have to worry about that. Heating it is fine once it's stiffened. Again, this is just another piece of fabric. This is another silk. As you can see, soaks up the stiffener quite easily, and you don't need a lot. Again, I'm going to try and get that evenly coated, just so I have the one colour instead of a mixed batch. If you're happy with it being a little bit mixed, well, you know, you can do what you like. You don't have to be perfect with it. And now onto some sinamay. This is sinamay, hand woven A grade. It's quite dense weave. Sometimes this close weave like this is called pinnapock, which is another name for it. Pinnock-pock, and pinnock-pock is just a name for a fine sinamay. Exactly the same fibre. It's just a lot finer weave. And if I was stiffening my sinamay, I would generally do it before I've made the hat. You can stiffen it afterwards, but it's a lot better in many ways to do it before. So you can see that I've got my stiffener on there. There are a few windows there, and that's probably because I had it on that piece of paper. But if you keep using your brush and work that stiffener in, you'll get rid of all those little windows. You need to do that though before it dries. If you let it dry, then those windows will become permanent in there, and they're very hard to remove once it's dry. So make sure you work that stiffener in, not very much on your brush when you're doing sinamay, and you should be pretty right. So I'm going to leave them to dry and then we'll show you what happens. So we're back and these samples have dried, so I just want to show you a little bit. So here is a piece of fur felt that hasn't been stiffened at all. So this is just how it comes, and you can see how it's quite nice and floppy. With the powder stiffener, it's quite stiff, actually really quite rigid. You can steam this and get more shape into it again, but it's worked really well with just one coat of stiffener at that recommended rate. For a comparison to standard resins stiffener, here's the same piece of felt stiffened with that. As you can see, it's stiff. It's not quite as stiff as the powder stiffener, but it's quite fine for felt. What you might find with felt is, as with all the stiffeners, you might want to dilute it a little bit more. Quite often you don't want a felt hat that's stiff like that. But as you can see, the feel of it and the handle of the felt hasn't changed. Like, there's no residue on the top from the stiffener. It's just nice and fluffy still. So that's a really good thing. Next, onto the parasol. As you can see here, well, you can't see that it's stiff, but if I try and pull it apart, it's not going to work, whereas with the unstiffened one, I can easily flex that like that. So it works quite well. As you can see here, this is a white parasol, and you can see that the colour is pretty much the same there. I can't actually tell the difference between these two just by looking. So onto the silk organza. Well, it's not as stiff as a board, but silk organza never does go like that. You can see it's a little bit shiny perhaps, and that's because the stiffener's making windows on the fabric. If you really wanted to, you could probably get them out when you're stiffening it, but it's pretty difficult on organza. And here's the one from the resin solution. It's much the same, not much difference. You can see that neither of the stiffeners has changed the colour noticeably. Onto our other silk samples. As you can see, both of the stiffeners here have changed the colour of the fabric a little bit, but that's what you get with pretty much any stiffener that you want to put on a fabric like this. It's always going to darken the fabric and will give it a different sort of look. But as you can see, both of them have stiffened this fabric, so it's sort of like paper now, which is ideal for making your French flowers. And again, with our cotton here, cotton fabric, it's slightly changed the colour of both with our powder stiffener and our resin stiffener. The powder stiffener has changed the colour a little bit more. It's a little bit more browny colour, but it's still fairly white, and that's not too bad. And again, with our sinamay, here we've got the stiffened bit with the powder and the unstiffened piece, which is quite flexible on the bias like that. And the same sinamay with our resin stiffener. Not much difference between the feel of both of those. And both of them have got this nice shiny surface. So there you go. It works pretty well on just about any material that you want to use in millinery, so why not give it a go?